This episode is sponsored by Audible. Get a free audiobook of your choice that you get to keep with their free trial. You can learn more at lutherancartographer.com/audible. The Lutheran Cartographer, Episode 64. Welcome to the Lutheran Cartographer, the podcast where we explore what it's like to be Lutheran in different places. I'm your host, Nicholas Weber. Today we are going to Rochester, New York, to hear from Pastor Mark Brown of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. Pastor Brown, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Help orient our listeners geographically. They probably know where New York State is in the Northeast, but where's Rochester?
Okay. New York is like this triangle, and at the bottom right is New York City. We're on the other far side of the triangle in some ways. Buffalo is kind of all the way over on the other corner of that. So you go along the baseline. And then Rochester is just a little bit up of the hypotenuse of the triangle. Rochester is about an hour away from Buffalo, right on the Great Lakes. We've got Erie coming down one way, and you've got Lake Ontario going across the top, and we can get snow from both of those.
All right, great. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and how did you end up in Rochester?
I think it's probably because of how, I was assigned to St. Mark's out of seminary. I went to seminary from, I went to seminary. I worked for IBM for about 10 years. And I was at that time living on the other side of New York. But, I went to seminary from New York. And so I think they tend to, if you come from a place, they send you back to that place oftentimes. But of course, St. Louis, LCMS doesn't really know New York. That one side of New York from the other, it's all New York, and it's like, well, it's quite a bit different. I always joke around that the Hudson River on that side of New York is your East Coast. That's your I-95 corridor. Whereas Rochester, Buffalo, and stuff like that feels more like, it's Great Lakes, upper Midwest. And I grew up in the Illinois-Iowa border on the Mississippi River, northern Illinois. And so right there on the edge of that upper Great Lakes, upper Midwest area. And this feels a lot like where I grew up at. Now, my mom would yell at me for saying that, but, she's a Midwestern bigot, so she's...
All righty. So then it sounds like then, since there are these two totally different cultures that you've dealt with in New York, how would you draw that out? What are some of the similarities, the differences? How would you go about telling somebody or explaining to somebody about how that cultural difference plays itself out?
Spiritually, New York is kind of the same. When I think about it, it's more linguistic, at least from my mind, it's more linguistic. The differences would be linguistic and I'll say ethnic. The far side of New York, where I spent about 10 years, is more ethnic in terms of, and I use ethnic in terms of, Ellis Island ethnic. It has those kind of overtones, and it speaks in an Eastern type, not really dialect, but it uses Eastern words, and it thinks of itself, I would say, as part of that big Excella I-95 corridor. Where I'm at had at least at one point had a ton of Germans. The Germans came over, and they kept, when they came this way, if they didn't go down like the Saxons to Texas and New Orleans and come up, they came across. And so, even the history of the Missouri Synod has the Buffalo Synod, and there's all these other little things spread out along the Great Lakes. And that's how you get a lot of things, in where I'm at here along the Great Lakes, is these Germans stopped, this looked good, and they stepped here. Some of them kept pushing on. They would follow the Great Lakes all the way around. And so that's, I think, the history of migration from the east to the west, or at least from the east to the Midwest, ends up being having this place feel a lot more home to that Midwestern where I grew up. Now, spiritually, surprisingly, spiritually, New York, both sides have this overwhelming collapsed Catholic feel to them. There's, the grandparents are probably still every Sunday mass goers, but it's the parents' generation that that stopped going, and the kids who are now, let's say if I take that down, the grandparents, people who are now 80 are still going weekly. The people who are now 50 to 60 stopped going and haven't been for a long time. Their kids in the 20 to 40 age range vaguely think of themselves as Catholic, but they've only been to church maybe 3 or 4 times in their life, but they're Catholic in some way. They would know that, well, or they would at least say, my family has been a Catholic. And maybe that's how I kind of track it more. If you ask the grandparents and you get into that conversation, they'll end up saying, I go to St. Joe's, or I'm part of St. Joe's Parish. The parents, that 60-year-old will say, I'm Roman Catholic. The kids will end up saying, well, my parents were Catholic. I kind of grew up with it around there. And that overwhelmingly is part and parcel of everything that goes on spiritually in the area. It's just that weight of Catholicism that's around. There's also, I would say, the other interesting historical bit is right around Rochester. It's called the Burned Over District.
Oh.
Charles Granderson Finney, famous Second Great Awakening character, the Anxious Bench and everything else like that. He was the guy. This area is the original burned over area that he came through here with that Second Great Awakening, and all kinds of Protestant churches, Baptist to non-denominational, all kinds of different things, got started when he came through and continued on for a long time afterwards. But you have that same type of, they call it the burned over district because, everybody was on fire and now it's gone out, or, it was the Great Awakening happened and we are living in the, third generation away from that. So even on the Protestant side, there's this sense of, there was a great renewal, or there was a great influx of people, and now it's significantly reduced or gone. Now you have, and layering through there, and the way I kind of describe it, recognizing that, let's say in the 90s, area was still kind of growing, and people were moving out, but the denominational churches themselves, the Protestant side, were having enough troubles themselves with people leaving that they didn't think about starting a new congregation further out, or at least not fast enough. So you get all of these non-denominational places that start, and they essentially, I'll say, strip mine the older congregations. However they're doing it, Worship Wars was one of them, but they're all the boomers. They're taking the boomers out through any means necessary, out of the denominational churches into the non-denoms, into these big things, and these big things are still here. But occasionally, their founding pastor retires and the place blows up because the transition doesn't. Or one of them locally here, he got, I'll say he didn't get nationwide famous, but he got regionally kind of famous. And then he went off and did some really crazy things. And, his place really took a dive. And that affected, those types of things just affect everybody else that's doing ministry in the area. So it's been, that spiritual conversation here always starts with that kind of weight, whether it's the collapsed Catholic, the granddaughter of the burned over district, or I was brought into the grand evangelical movement and the mega church idea, and it just didn't work out, or it hasn't, or it does work out, but they're off doing their own little thing, which as often or not is not teaching Christianity as much as it's simply a spiritual way station.
Yeah, that must be really hard to see. Well, let's return to the religious question in just a minute. I want to ask you about what you think some of the best things are about being in Rochester.
Oh, the glorious summers. The weather, people, it's like, you pay for it. As I tend to say, you pay for it from, let's say, late November through early April, because you'll get snow and lots of it from late November through early April. You will get snow on Easter. You can get snow on Easter. But from mid-May until late October, early November, it's just gorgeous. It never gets, it's like 70s, 80s, and wonderful. The second thing I would say is local type things in some ways work. It's like local government actually works here. Now I've lived in St. Louis, and I've lived in small town America, and I've lived in Poughkeepsie, or the Wapato, the other side of New York, and none of those places did local government work. What you would expect them to do, they just didn't do, or they did poorly. But here in Rochester, it works, along with lots of, and there's lots of things, I'll say, like, what you would call civic society type things that are still working. Wonderful, whether it's it's not just, like the baseball teams and, lots of usually sports things, but not just sports things. There's other things as well. Lots of civic society that's still going on. Now, I will tell you that part of my experience, we as pastors kind of complain about the sports guys all the time because, they started doing sports on Sunday morning, or that if we only had the attention that we think the sports guys do, we would be, the church used to have that and we don't have it anymore. That's a typical rant. I've coached Little League for 7 years now. I think it maybe more, but I'll tell you that those things work, but they're working the same way that congregations are still working, that there's a thin bench of people that are doing everything that make it continue to work, that dedicate themselves, that this is my mission or this is what I do. And everybody else, in some ways, free rides on that. But they get the great experience of having these wonderful things that work, but it's being kept together by, small numbers of people. Maybe it always was thus, but that's not my impression. At least it was never my impression from, say, deep memories of a childhood growing up, that those type of things were kept afloat by everybody, and now it's smaller groups.
Yeah.
So the weather and just how the civic society is pretty good around here.
That's really good to hear. On the flip side, what are some of the challenges of Rochester? You've already mentioned paying for those beautiful summers. What else would you say if somebody was thinking about moving there? You would say, you got to be aware of this.
Man, the winters are bad. I know I've said that, but I really have to emphasize the winters are bad, especially when you get a bad one. A few years ago, we had a couple bad ones in a row, and I was like, okay, I'm getting older, and I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can take another one of these. Luckily, we've had a couple of nicer ones, but the winters are bad. If you have kids, the schools may be good in a generic sense, but the taxes are so high that nobody, unless you're a millionaire, and it doesn't matter, you're not going to send. There really aren't the only private schools that exist anymore here are high-end Catholic prep. So unless you can afford to pay $30,000 to continue that kind of schooling, you're going to go to the public school, and the public schools are about what they're. I don't want to say they're bad. They're really good for what they are, but they're just perfect representations of what's coming out of ed schools today.
And by that you mean the sort of evangelical progressivism and the kind of shock troops of the New World kind of thing.
Yeah, shock troops of the New World Order, the new normal. Yeah, I love your term there. That progressive evangelical or evangelical progressive. Your kids, when they go there, will be propagandized quite a bit for this particular lifestyle or this particular way of living, and you will not have any ability to. You really will not have any ability to push back against it other than in the sanctity of your own home. It just, it's not going to happen. I get to the point where I'm kind of worried even there that, if your kids say the wrong thing at school and they assume it's coming from your parents, man, you're attracting the eye of Sauron on you.
Yeah, good reasons to get your kids out of government schools, I suppose.
I know. Well, and that's the problem. And, I say that's the problem in Rochester, that doing that is darn near impossible unless you're homeschooling, because it's just the tax rates are so high that, anybody that's working a normal job,
kind of thing.
Anybody that's a normal job, there just is not the money left over to do it.
Yeah, that's brutal.
Even if you were doing it, even if you were like a two income family, and they'd have to be two really good incomes, to have enough left over of the second one after taxes, and it would probably pretty much all go to. Now, maybe it's just a continuation that way, that a lot of people live that way, that the entire second income more or less just pays for daycare for younger kids. We run a preschool, and we see that quite a bit. We're cheaper than a lot of places, and we consistently say we're a preschool, but a lot of people come in and are part of it, and we kind of know that their salary is paying for us to raise their kids. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah, it's a very strange time to be in America. Let's take a moment for a word from our sponsor. Folks, if you like podcasts, you will enjoy Audible. It's a service that gives you an audiobook to listen to each month of your choice from a large library. And they want to get you started with a free trial offer that includes an audiobook that you get to keep. So go to lutherancartographer.com/audible to get your free audiobook and start your free trial today. If you're not sure what book to check out, I recommend taking a look at Pastor Jonathan Fisk's Broken: 7 Christian Rules That Every Christian Should Break as Often as Possible. This was recently released on Audible. I'm very excited about it. In the book, Pastor Fisk goes through the classic pitfalls of moralism, mysticism, and rationalism, as well as several others. Check it out at lutherancartographer.com/audible. Let's get back to the show. Let's go on and talk about what it's like to be Lutheran there. You've already mentioned the religious atmosphere of this burned over area of the remnants of the Second Great Awakening, and we've also talked about the number of lapsed Catholics. What else would you say listeners might be interested in knowing about the Lutheran experience in Rochester?
Well, the Lutherans used to be, because the migration east, compared to, I'd say, Lutherans who the Saxons and the Missouri Synod experience usually starts with the Saxons in Missouri, and they came up from the south. They came through there. Most of the Lutherans, or a lot of Lutherans, started coming in from the east, and they trekked across the Great Lakes, leaving all kinds of things. And so there's the Buffalo Synod, which is a very big early Lutheran entity. And there's even connections, in this area and stuff like that with what used to be called the General Synod and the Pennsylvania Ministerium and things like that. We're talking about 18th, early 19th century type things. Lutheranism has a long history here in those regards, and it's left a lot of congregations in its wake and that type of thing. So there are quite a few congregations that dot here. A lot of them are in smaller towns or smaller areas. Lutheranism used to be a much, much bigger thing. My impression, and this is somebody's, I wasn't part of it, but my impression is that what used to be a very defined identity that was known in the area and like that was lost between, like, I talk around like 1964 as being peak church. Go from like 1964 to probably the late 80s. That entire identity, I think, was lost in the area to the point that Lutheranism is just a non-entity in a lot of cases, even though there's lots of these congregations that still dot the ground. There's no recognition of it. St. Mark's has been here in one form, has been at its current location in its current place since 1911. It existed as a congregation before that, and it existed as one before that spoke German as early as 1884. So, there's an 1884 connection in German. And we joked around, the first church split happened in 1901 when the kids of those German speakers wanted to speak English. And so they split, and some of them kept speaking German. The others founded St. Mark's and started speaking English. And 20 years later, 15 years later, the remains of the German congregation come back in. But the Lutheran experience is one of having these congregations that have a long history, but very few people understanding or knowing that history. And I even say that I would say it's now been 3 years ago. My chapel, our sanctuary, has stained glass windows on the sides, and the bottom of the stained glass windows have names on them. And we buried, I would say about 3 years ago, the last person who is kind of like a direct descendant of those names on those stained glass windows. So there's that, these congregations now exist in a different sense. They're no longer family-owned enterprises or long-term family things. It's people that have come in from the area for jobs, people who have found the Lutheran Church through other means. That's the people that you see coming into the Lutheran Church. Catholics who are tired of what the Catholic Church looks like in the area, which includes lots of bad things. So you end up being it ends up being a hospital ward in some ways, or a spiritual hospital ward, in that a lot of people coming through who have been burned in other ways, but find something in Lutheranism that's a little different.
I see. That makes sense. Let's take it up to the present day as well. We've talked kind of about the march of history and how much things have changed. What's it like right now to be a Lutheran in terms of day-to-day life, interacting with the culture at large? Is Rochester a very secular place, or is it have some religious sensibility? What would you say the day-to-day looks like for you and your congregants?
It's very, very secular. It's a very, very secular place. It doesn't. There are pockets of spirituality, but you also have it mixed in. One of the things that I often say is I like meeting honest pagans, and sometimes you see these honest pagans actually reemerging. That they don't have a deep experience with Christianity. The way that you can kind of think of, we think in history, Abraham Lincoln is not an Orthodox Christian by any stretch of the imagination. Yet you go and read his inaugural addresses, and it's drenched with that kind of Christian imagery. He's a product of Christendom. Where I'm at, there is no such thing as Christendom anymore. So nobody is getting a formation in Christianity that is not actively engaged in a church somewhere. And that's now, 30-year-olds have grown up in that. 30-year-olds don't have that connection. And so you're meeting 30-year-olds, or you can meet 30-year-olds that honestly just don't know what church even is. And so you can have conversations with them, when it's like, well, what do you do? It's like, I'm a pastor. Like, well, where at, or what does that entail? What do you do? And so you can have honest conversations about that with people, if especially if you catch them a little bit off guard. But you can have honest conversations. Whereas even, I'll say, at the start of my ministry here, 15 years or 10 years ago, more like 15, it was the remnants of that kind of Christendom idea were still floating around. And you still have that kind of, and I think part of the pastoral challenge is that people who are 60 or older still live in that era. People who are 50 and younger don't. And so there are demands, and there are things, and especially when you realize that the vast majority of your monetary ability to continue to do things exists with those 60-year-olds. Plus, you have to talk a different language with them, because there are still people involved in there who I would say are cultural Christians. Everybody's got a church, and this happens to be mine, or everybody's got a place, and this is where I go. by the time you get down to 40-year-olds, nobody is there who doesn't believe it.
Yeah.
Very different situation between, and it's a stark divide between those two groups.
Yeah, I love the way that you just articulated that, because that's something that I've been thinking about for a while, though not in those terms, and I never could quite put my finger on it. But hearing you say it that way, that makes a lot of sense and reflects a lot of what I'm seeing in my local parish as well. As we even some of the 40-year-olds, like, they just don't understand, like, the challenges that I hate the phrase, but younger people are facing in terms of where the culture's at and what their job prospects are like, what their marriage prospects are like. There's just this huge gap of, like, misunderstanding what other generations are going through.
These life scripts that they all, they might have rewritten them around the edges or ignored some of them, but these life scripts that they more or less followed and had good, successful lives, or had, were able to be launched into successful lives. That 20-year-old today, there aren't any. Yeah. There just aren't. The idea of, had a funeral for a wonderful man, 90 something years old. He served in World War II, came back, met his wife before he had gone, but he met his wife in Walther League. They spent their summers at the district camp. And their entire life was part and parcel of this. And it was, the script was, he met the love of his life, at camp and church, and they were forever part of the congregation. She was baptized, confirmed, married and buried from the same congregation. He was one that came in later, but when he was married, and then we just buried him. But those scripts are just gone.
Yeah.
The chance of walking in, unless we as congregations start working together better, or figure that out, the chance of a 20-year-old finding his or her, his future wife or his or her spouse at church is just not strong. We don't have enough people in those age ranges to do that.
Yeah, and those that we do have been. Yeah, it's a very tough challenge. Yeah,
it's a tough challenge. No, I think that's why I said we could. You'd either have to collapse, like I joke around. It's like there are 4 congregations of the LCMS within a 10-mile circle, right around where I am. Mm-hmm. Of course, all 4 of them are struggling in various different ways. All 4 of them, but all 4, if all 4 of them decided to get together, they could form one really good congregation, strong congregation. They all kind of look the same, but to do that would require a level of commitment and work that people are just not willing to give right now. And there's also, a sense of, I'm giving up my history or my identity or things like that. And whereas the congregation I'm serving at, like I talked about burying the last person associated with those names, might be willing to do that. A couple of the other ones wouldn't even think about that. They're not there yet.
And of course, we don't have. I don't want to get into the whole discussion right now, but of course, there's also the disadvantages of the merging, that then you lose people along the way. But I'm sure you know all those things and have thought very long and hard about them. But I want to move on and talk more about what it's like to raise a family there. We've already talked about the schooling situation that's really difficult, but tell us a little bit more about how raising a family is there in Rochester.
Raising a family in Rochester probably depends more upon. Now, I can imagine if you were at a congregation that was larger than mine, maybe the church could still function as a family type center in that way. Most of the congregations, like I talked about, those 4 congregations, none of those 4 can really function as a family center type thing. They just don't have the numbers to do that. So most of your family type activities are going to be associated with what I called earlier the civic society, whether it's a child gets involved in scouts and the parents are then part of scouts, or like I've done with coaching baseball, little league. You're coaching little league and you're involved in the little league pro stuff, which gets you involved in a group of people that are engaged around that. There's these little civic society, these little platoons that are remarkably alive, and that's what family life kind of looks like. It's centered, it's child-centered in that sense, and it is available. Although I will tell you that there's a divide, even in West Henrietta here. Those kind of civic entities probably pull from, mostly I would say probably pull from the top half of the economic curve. I probably don't find myself in that top half of the economic curve, but as the pastor of a place, you're part of, there's a certain amount of social capital involved there. So, I get parcel of that. There are a lot of places, or a lot of kids. I can see it with, just the area I grew up, we live in here, that, the kids, there just isn't any of that, it's not, for depending on where you're at, it's not that family friendly. You go to school, you go to work, and there isn't much else. Some of them are connected with, long-term family. There's some people who are here long-term. And so you get large family gatherings, but even that's breaking up. Because I know that I know people who they talk about having great grandparents, and there's still a great grandparent around, and then there's like 4 grandparents, and there are but by the time you get that, and the grandparents have all kinds of cousins and other people that are there, or there's all kinds of cousins in the parents' age because of that, and then when you get down to the kids, there's like 3. And so you see this narrowing down of things. And so it can be really interesting, and there are stuff, but you have to put yourself out to be part of it.
That makes sense.
And there are lots of people. You have to put yourself out to be part of it. And there are people who are maybe even be part of it on the surface, but not in deeper ways. Like, you get like 12 kids on a baseball team, and, 3 to 6 of them are there, and their parents are involved, and, you have fun, and things like that. 6 of them are, their parents drop them off, or one of them does, somebody else picks them up. They'll miss every other week because they're shuttling between divorced parents here and there. So in that sense, it reflects a lot of American society at large. But if you're willing to put in the effort, Rochester's in better shape than a lot of places because it still has these civic society entities that are working.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Pastor Brown, we're running a little short on time, but I want to make sure that we hit one of my favorite parts, and that is asking you about what are some of your favorite things to see and do and places to eat. But we don't have much time, so if you could give us, I know it's hard, it's like picking your favorite hymn, but one good restaurant, one good thing to do.
Oh my. Restaurant-wise, I'm not going to give you a restaurant. I tend to be eating local restaurants. But I'll tell you, there's a wonderful donut place called called Donut Delight, Dan Delight is guy, and you'll have apple fritters that will, give you a heart attack immediately. They're so big. But even better are these almond croissants. Are just they're so good. Now it takes me about 20 minutes to drive there to pick up these things, and 20 minutes to drive back, but they're worth it. Favorite thing to do. A lot of people, if you are an outdoors person, it's a wonderful area in those regards, even in the winter. But you can ride. You can even go ride the Erie Canal, which is a big thing around here. You can whistle your 16 tons as much as you want right along here, because we're right on the Erie Canal, and so there's a lot of outdoorsy type stuff in those regards. That's around. I think there's also a lot of Rochester always has been a little bit, if you like Philharmonic, if you like upper crusty type things, Rochester is excellent. From having had Kodak here, which has the Eastman School of Music, which is probably like after Juilliard, the next one underneath there. And there's a center of excellence, the Philharmonic, the Eastman School. There's all kinds of wonderful, the Jazz Festival that goes on. There's all kinds of things that happen, artsy type things that are not middlebrow, but that are like highbrow artsy things. And if you like that, Rochester is an excellent site for all of that.
Fantastic. Now, as we start to close out the podcast, I want to make sure to give you the opportunity to point our listeners where you'd like. Your church's website, places to follow you online. Where would you like to point our listeners?
The website is probably a good one. It's St. Mark's Lutheran, but all spelled out, SAINTMARKSLUTHERAN.org. That's, and I post weekly the sermons and anything else that goes up there. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want, but honestly, I don't know if I would follow me on Twitter. I'm obnoxious.
I do.
I'm not on Twitter, I'm kind of Mark Brown. I'm not Pastor Mark so much as I am there. But Brown MP is just who I am there on Twitter. Either one of those places, you would get a flavor of that and be able to contact me. As they say, anybody who follows me on Twitter, I follow back, so it doesn't. You don't have to worry about that. And we do as I said, post the sermons and the podcasts, and they're available through Google. Through all the same places you probably can find this one. You'll find ours as well if you want.
Wonderful. Thank you for your time today, Pastor Brown. What are your parting thoughts for our listeners?
It's kind of funny, but I would tend to say, as one who has traveled a lot or lived a bunch of different places, I really enjoy Rochester. It's been a wonderful place. But I would tend to say, also as one who's lived in a lot of places, that old line about the grass is always greener tends to be true. The places you're at is not as bad as you think. If you're looking over something, sometimes I would say, no, it's like, look again at where you're living and where can you get involved that would make those civic society things work that currently aren't. And that might be the best advice that I could ever give somebody.
That makes sense. Thank you again. God's peace.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Lutheran Cartographer. For more about the things that we talked about today, check out the show notes page for the show. It's at lutherancartographer.com/64. Be sure and check out that Audible offer along with that free audiobook. You can do that at lutherancartographer.com/audible. I want to encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to the show on iTunes or on Stitcher or on your favorite podcast app. That way you don't miss an episode. And until next time, I'm Nicholas Weber. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.